Welcome, everybody, to Ask Strong Towns Anything, weekly exclusive for our Strong Towns members who are building a movement for change across North America and actually increasingly around the world as well. I'm Norm. I get to be the Director of Movement Building for Strong Towns and the member advocate, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today. And we're going to start with as a part of our process is this is a reader mailbag session. And so in that context, it'll be sort of across the board, lots of different topics. So nothing is off limits today. Truly nothing ever normally is anyways, except for partisanship, which we generally try to avoid like a plague. However, along the way, as we work through these questions that come up that are arising out of the things that you face in your communities, my goal for this session is just that we could probably take about 8 specific questions and work our way through them and kind of think through them. And don't be shy to unmute yourself partway through and say, hey, I've got some further thoughts on this, and we will dive in and take a look at it this way. The first question was submitted, and it was submitted by a member who said, our small town is planning a large new development of a large hotel, a chain restaurant, a gas station on unused farmland along a strode that's on the outside of the town. So pinch me if you've heard this before, and I'm going to have a pretty bruised arm. This is a very familiar type of pattern that we see. And she said, we're worried that this will increase traffic, but also more, and we would say more critically, take away from the local hotels, restaurants, and businesses inside the town. Local businesses have wanted to use the land for a small development of local production and community space. Instead, they are being ignored. And so I'd love to hear thoughts from the chat or thoughts from others in the call as well. But I'll offer a couple of first level responses. And the first is that this is the trouble of all of the transportation infrastructure investments we make being cannibalized or sort of preyed upon by this type of development. Chuck has gone so far in his book to propose that truly, if state DOTs and other agencies that were funding highways really had their priorities right, they would be imposing access taxes on projects that are essentially adding new constriction and new obligations for new highway and interchanges and things like this that prevent these road-like environments from actually functioning like they should, being a point-to-point connection between productive places. Instead, what these do in a fairly parasitical way is sort of latch in right next to the road and actually begin to create the congestion and the bottlenecks, that the differentials of speed that are the most significant way in which you create traffic, the way in which you create sort of the backlogs and the safety risks that are associated with the strode-like environment. And so there's a problem of understanding what the role of that strode is in the community. And almost certainly it is to get people from one area out farther away from you or at some distance to another productive destination. And yet by situating it right at that place, sort of prime location, rather than stored within the community where it's nested within a whole lot of other productive uses, you are creating this distended development pattern. Another reality is that these are the types of sites that often are marketed widely, typically not available to local investors, frequently are being promoted on sort of franchise-ready websites and things like this. It reminds me when I was in Port Arthur, Texas, providing a talk there at a small business symposium. So it was for small business owners. In the previous year, the speaker they had invited was presenting on how to make their highway adjacent lots suitable for franchise development. And it felt like the exact opposite of what towns like Port Arthur, as well as places like this, truly need. And so there ought to be, as Chuck would describe in sort of the early stages of his questions about the types of development that we were seeing in our communities, there ought to be a very, very, very careful question about should we be situating new types of development that are going to require the extension of municipal services out to these sites when they are better situated within the core of a community. For this to be used for local production, I'm not sure what's intended with that, or community space. But the reality is there's such a need for your gateway into your community to be a road that moves people into your spaces and then allows for the dispersal of traffic to various sites within your community, rather than sort of conglomerating it all at the entrance point, creating a choke point that affects the rest of the community. But I'd love to throw it over to the other folks that are on the call as well. Are there other things that stand out in this question that you want to sort of raise or reflect on? Michael, you're unmuted, so if you like, you can take the stage, or maybe it was an inadvertent unmuting, but go ahead.
If somebody wants to build like a little mini strip mall in the middle of a road in the middle of nowhere, I don't think you can stop them. I just say when you make it incentive like money wise, you'd have to pay a lot more to do that
Yeah,
and to undisturb the flow of traffic on that road. So you'd pay for an off ramp that would be suitable enough so the traffic flow of the road isn't slowing down because people can make a right turn to get off or a
yeah,
left turn even.
yeah.
So I like the idea of charging people more if they're gonna impact fees. Try
Hmm.
not to
Yeah,
disturb the purpose of the road.
yeah.
So I say build it, but you got to pay more to do so.
Right. Yeah. Whereas instead, what we typically see is the extension of subsidies, the promise, hey, we will provide the infrastructure up to the lot line in order to incentivize this. And so if you're on Google Maps, you could take a look at Chugwater, Wyoming. I had the mayor of Chugwater on. If you haven't heard of it, there's a reason it's a tiny two-bit town in Wyoming. Don't share. Oh, I think even Joshua, the mayor there, would agree with that summary. But they actually, through the state investment arm, had basically rolled out the welcome mat for a special frontage road to be built for a small little hotel to be situated off the freeway, but sort of also off site of the actual town itself. And so they previously had, there was a saloon, there's a general store, there's a mercantile, very small little community, which means they have very scarce resources. And in that context, he took me on a quick little Google Maps tour, and you can see there is a single use road that runs at some distance to get to that hotel that, because of its location, actually doesn't fit the scale of what's needed in the community and really struggles to attract enough people to regularly use it. But at the same time, the municipality is on the hook for all of that street, and there are no other productive uses. And this was the question that Chuck would frequently raise, is saying, it may be that we get a new, farm store here, as well as a gas bar, but what else are we going to get? And based on the way that we build this out, are we likely to see more investment over time to accrue greater benefit to us? And that's the beauty of a downtown street. As you fill in each of the gaps, you get more and more productive activity. As you then allow the gaps to be filled, and then the adjacent areas to start to be densified, you start to see even more productive uses. So that way you enable additional streets to become platforms for building wealth, in addition to being great residences and great neighborhoods. And this is a pattern of development that's very different from that. You rarely see new uses inserted. Instead, most frequently, as we see with the hotel in Chugwater, but also with every Sam's Club, with all kinds of Walmarts, these are stores that are built briefly. They pop up sort of overnight, and then they're gone. My brother was working as a landscaper, chatting with a roofer in Lethbridge, Alberta. And Lethbridge is just like every other place, where he said you wouldn't believe the restrictions that Walmart has put on the development of their stores. He said, we are putting on a 10 to 15 year roof. And we asked, like, are you sure? Like, we should be putting on something better. They said, no, because that's by the time that 15 years has rolled around, our market demographics show that the amount of local incomes will have dropped, and we just need to move on to the next site. This is what we mean by a parasitical or extractive type of practice of development. And so on this question, I mean, I think this is particular to smaller communities where the impact can be felt so significantly. But does anybody else want to jump in and maybe reflect on their own experience with this as well? And then we'll go on. Yeah, Danny, please.
I'd go. Yeah, we had something similar done because we have a lot of reservation land and multiple different tribes in my county. One to the north of my city and one to the south. And to the south, we just had a gas station, Starbucks, like not strip mall, just giant field of asphalt effectively get put in.
The blob.
Yeah, our city is also like I was counting like 5 gas stations within the city limits for 5,000 people. And like if you look at our city's budget, it's like 20% of the like general fund comes from like gas retail tax.
Okay.
And so there's been a lot of groaning about this gas station going in because it essentially undercuts all the gas stations in town because it's on native land. They don't have to pay as high of taxes.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, in my opinion, going to have an accelerating effect of like where we kind of already needed to be, like diversifying into other forms of retail tax. Like we've got lots of vacant uh, properties and buildings and whatnot, like many other places. And it's like something like two or almost like a third of our retail tax comes from like gas stations and like the car dealership in town. And then auto shops and stuff too, like automotive uses. So it just went in a few months ago, and I do expect it's going to have an accelerating effect to like where we would have already ended up, where people were not spending as much on gas, because there are other gas stations on native land that, like, you know, 50 to 60 cents cheaper at those gas stations. People are willing to make the drive out there.
Yeah, and Donna, will come to you in a moment, but the other element of it is that when we think of diversifying what the options in our community, I often sense that there are community leaders that want to pick and choose what they want. So they're like, all right, let's have, sort of dial down how many gas stations we get, and can we have maybe another couple of bakeries, and what about a dry, some other version of whatever is contemporary, when the reality is, like, if you want diversity, you have to simply open up the sort of broad spectrum of possibilities by critically removing parking requirements. Parking requirements are a major killer of the types of things that can actually move back into a space, as well as allowing for a significant loosening of your types of retail zoning districts and all of the overlays and all of the added restrictions. And the irony is that you might not get the specific mix of things that you want. There's sort of this mixecologist version of, hey, this is how you get the perfect creative class city. And there's an allure to that. And I saw this, I mentioned Port Arthur. So their downtown plan lays out in almost explicit detail the types of things that they envision, and it was passed in 2014. None of it has come to pass, and so much of that is a consequence of them specifying, even on a lot by lot basis, what they expect to see in those types of sites. This would be perfect for a farmer's market, but if the property owner has no interest in ever doing that, or would be a bad owner of a property like that, but would be amazing at rolling out some other use of that property, we can get into these sort of prescriptive situations where we are trying to really define what that's going to look like, and it doesn't work. It just does not work. It might work once, but it really doesn't allow for further organic adaptation. And I would even question it if it ever worked that first time in reality as well. What about for you, Donna? I noticed that you had unmuted as well. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I've been advocating for no incentives in greenfield space for quite some time, and I guess, the beating of the bush over and over again, there is movement. And even with the housing crisis, the developers want the city to take on not only maintenance after they put it in, they want the city to put it in. And I'm like a flat no. And there's other developers that want to have the city pay for low-income housing or affordable housing that's for the working class. There's some special state incentives that we have in Illinois that keep a cap for 23 years. And the apartment buildings have been there for 23 years. Developers are coming in, they want to do the whole thing market rate. Yeah. And my response is no, it needs to be at least 40% stay at cap. And if you want to, invest, and of course they back off. Yeah. The developers will back off, but I'm standing firm. Outsiders coming in and siphoning off, and they want incentives, they're not going to get my support. Yeah. So
yeah, Edward, and then Don or Tim, sorry.
Yeah, no, Donna, that's really, really important to share. What I found, a lot of the folks that are doing development on the edge of town, because maybe, especially in small towns, on the edge of town development, the incentives aren't necessarily a check. The incentives aren't necessarily funding for the water or sewer line. Some of the incentives are out there is an easier development review process or a more flexible development process than if you had to do it in the downtown or you had to do it adjacent to additional development. When we do our downtown work, all of a sudden there's 3 or 4 different committees that have to review it. There's lots of citizens that have looked at the last 8 decades of developments that I don't want any development because nothing's good. They show up to say no. But on the edge of town, where the big parcel is, they can kind of work in their sandbox. And the subsidy to them is the freedom to do that. Or the development standards are lesser, or we've let the developers set them in a plan unit development on the edge of town. If we were to make the edge of town follow everything we would for the center of town, you'd see a much different flip. So we may talk about the value per acre work. We may talk about how it's more long-term better investment for the downtown, but fundamentally on those, thinking just beyond the check, but why are we making it frankly easier on the edge or for a bigger development than in town?
Hmm. Yeah. Last word on this question to you, Tim, and then we'll go on to our second question.
Yeah, I'm glad Edward just said what he said. It's interesting. It's just looking at this question, it just makes me think, our entire town, I live in Warner Robins, Georgia, which
Mhm.
didn't exist until 1942. In 1942, it was entirely fields. And it was founded in 1942. So the entire town is the edge of town. We actually do not have a downtown, never had a downtown. The entire development process has been, exactly what you would expect post World War II. And I guess the question I'm asking when I read that question is, if you have an entire city that's built with that template, how do you begin to convince people that, hey, we need to kind of turn inward? Because you see, if you look at the older part of town, it's deteriorating, it's neglected.
Mm.
I have a great mayor. I know her fairly well. And they've done great work and want to actually build a downtown, but that's problematic as well when you're starting from scratch to build a downtown. So I don't really have much conclusions other than just to say that this question kind of makes my head explode a little bit. But it's an interesting one nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. In part because it is so common, and to your point about lacking a downtown, we actually had a group in Colorado that were interested. They said, we own some land and we recognize it is in the heart of the community. Is there any way for us to be guided by strong towns principles to actually proceed with turning this into a proper downtown? And in contrast, there was also a group in Prescott, Arizona, where the Prescott family investment company, as well as they have hands in many different things, they were saying, we've had this land and we're going to hold it for a lot longer until we know sort of where elements of the downtown and civic sort of areas are going to be. And then we'll start to develop ours. And that is the pure, it is a great way for your investment to increase in value. The trouble is there's a giant gaping hole in the middle of the community, but most of our other communities actually lack some of that developable land in the area. And they've made redevelopment of existing locations really difficult. And so those are some of those overlapping factors that definitely impact this. Let's go into our next question here, which is submitted by a brand new member. So I'm excited about this. And she was looking for direction on the development of a parks and rec space on soon to be sold 8 acres in a blighted community that is overlooked for parks activities. Edward, I'm going to put you on the spot because this is something that we had chatted about. And when we identified this question, we said, all right, let's definitely make sure that we cover this one. So what is your direction that you would say is consistent with a Strong Towns approach for development of these types of sites? Maybe if I could add sort of a little narrative, is the idea is oftentimes people will look at a space and say it could either be developed or be parks and rec space. And surely there's no way for there to be sort of a mingling of those two. And it feels that way. But what do you do with 8 acres in a blighted community?
Yeah, this is really tough because if I look at just the words, and I don't know the exact location, a blighted community by definition, just using the words, is a community that is lacking economics. So we can define blight as not growing as fast as somewhere else, but we can also define blight of below market, meaning that we're not, you know, whatever it may be. So when we look at that in that neighborhood, so if we are not able to fulfill our current obligations of what's there, we're going to add another obligation. So a community that's pretty well, probably well deserving of that public park space, it will only be as good as the first infusion of investment for the park. It will slowly decay over time, and because we won't have the resources to put back into that. 8 acres is also really big.
Yeah.
That's a big area of land. Um, you can get football fields, like multiple fields in that. So thinking through those types of things, uh, I would say that both are a bad deal.
Yeah.
Both development and the park. That's how I would start to it, and still somebody shared otherwise. Um, in Medicine Hat in Alberta, Canada, they they consider themselves to be the most overparked city in
Mhm.
all of Canada, and not parking, but public parks and amenities. They
Mhm.
have more per capita than anybody else, but they also have that huge liability. And when we were working with them on their community action lab, the struggle they had with their parks department is that we have this long list of everything that needs to be done, and we have a very short list of funds. So we can't do everything. And what they opted to do in this initial phase. So right now, if there's 8 acres and it's available and it's vacant today, let's take a strategy of maybe leasing it, like a lease with a buying option. Let's lease it for a year or two to the Parks Department, and we'll have an option to purchase it at that price for that time.
Hmm.
And that lease time, what Medicine Hat is doing in their parks, because they had a park in a neighborhood that they needed to make a $200,000 investment for a piece of play equipment. It would only impact like 30 families. That's who could get to this particular park. They weren't sure what age kids were on all the houses. And then not only did they not have the 200,000 for that park, they also had 13 other parks that needed the same type of upgrade.
Hmm.
What Medicine Hat did, if we take that kind of rental approach, they went and bought an equipment box for about $2,000. So it was something they could put in the back of a van. It had different types of aged equipment. So the parachute that the little kids like, it had soccer and basketball stuff for the older kids. It had tennis rackets and all the different stuff in it that the parks department could show up in the park with this kit. And they just announced, we're going to be in the park for this day for our pop-up. And whatever kids showed up, they had equipment to engage them in some activity. They could do this, so now not just 30 families, but every single family in the city could now get the benefit of that particular piece. And they were researching. So if only toddlers showed up to one park, or if only adults showed up to another park, they could survey that and they knew the type of investment they would make next. So we talk about that with roads, but we can do it with these public spaces as well. So that's kind of the short term with it.
Mhm.
Let's test a couple of things that we're not afraid to fail on
Yeah.
and not jump to any big decisions right away.
Yeah. And each time, I think we had a question similar to this last week, and the questions around we lack investment and we need to invest, of public funds is often there's a component that says actually, the language of blighted communities is just a blighted community to, in a very simplistic way, is a place that lacks confidence that if you invest $1 today, that it's going to be worth slightly more very soon. And that is one of the causes of that disinvestment sort of cycle that groups like the Oswego Neighborhood Alliance or Renaissance Association are really pivotal in helping to turn around places where investment is lacking by providing micro grants to blocks and saying, I think it's what 60% of the households have to like agree to invest some of their own money, and then a block grant will come to them to help them do simple projects like repairing awnings or improving porches or improving fences and those types of things. And there's such a value in that type of an approach that would actually precede any kind of the investment of public funds in things like an 8-acre park. Another element of it is when you see 8 acres, you want all of it. But when you ask the question, is there maybe some shared use that we can make work here? One of the recognitions that is that parks should generate sort of overflowing wealth into adjacent areas. If that's the case, one of the strategies that Chuck talked about when he was in Kamloops, BC, he was meeting with their city staffers and they said, hey, we've got this large vacant parking lot. It's municipally owned. It has been in our downtown core. It's sort of a blighted area. There's a lot of problems with transiency, sort of people moving through it. If people don't dare to park there because they deem it to be not safe, and yet like nothing is happening there. And so we want to sell it. And what sort of suggestions do you have for a request for proposals to put the thing up for auction? He said, no, plat it. Platting it is just when you carve up lot lines and you basically outline. And his whole thing was go to the place that is closest to an existing business and say, we are now releasing this small parcel and we're making it available for development. We're going to make sure that it is zoned in a very expansive category. So it can be many, many, many different things. And by doing that, you actually bring down the purchase price of it as well. You're not dealing with an $8 million or $12 million purchase. Or, I mean, because one of the realities, sometimes you will see 8 acres get sold for a song to somebody that they are buying the entire parcel. And when you calculate it, you say, why did they get such a sweetheart deal? It's because they were the only bidder that came to the table. And there's something deeply wrong with fire sales of public assets. There's no need for that. What Chuck was proposing then is then once that first lot has sold and is developed, there's proof of concept and proof of viability. Additional lots, he's actually suggested do the one behind it. So do half, if it's half the width of the street, do half of that lot and then the one behind it and make sure there's a little laneway. You're reconnecting your grid in that way. And what you then do is you begin to create these clusters and the rest can remain as is or be modestly improved. Allow food trucks to start to congregate in those areas, those types of economic activities. And say in the instance of an 8-acre park, you say a portion of this is parkland. And another portion of this is for a new sort of type of small lot development. Some of that could be turned over for the development of starter homes. Small lots make great sites for small homes. Likely in many blighted communities, even though there are available homes, many times those homes are not well suited to the actual income levels that people have to be able to afford a home. So if they can purchase something that is new to them, but actually is better suited to their income and to the space needs that they actually have, there can be a lot of development opportunities like that as well. Now, same thing, we're going to open this up for a broader conversation. Is there anything that jumps out at you as you're listening that you want to take up in this question? I see a big comment in the chat, which is fantastic as well. Thank you, Danny, for that. Oh, I see a question from Danny, but anybody want to jump in on this one? Otherwise, we are going to transition. Oh, yes.
I was just also thinking about the conversation with someone you brought on who did that conversation about parks and rec and how to manage it. And that was also a very good convo and thing to direct people towards, I think. I forget
Yeah,
who it
that's
was.
right. Jamie Sabick.
Thank you.
We called it anti-fragile parks and rec. That was a great discussion as well. Yeah, thank you, Danny, for the throwback. Well, let's take up a question. So first, I've got it, Danny. We're going to take you on. Do you want to introduce your question?
Yeah, sure. It wasn't explicitly a question. I was just poking around on the Action Lab, trying to find content related to transient occupancy tax, or like hotel development as a method of like boosting the general fund sort of thing. In our downtown, we have like the main street and then just, less than a few hundred feet from the main street is the waterfront. And in between that, we have like a lot of parking lots, which oftentimes get allocated for like fishing boats because the fishing tournaments bring in money on the weekends and then they sit vacant for, the other 90% of the time, which is something that I've brought up. But also adjacent to that, we have some hotels, which also have, no surprise, large parking lots, sort of like 1 or 2 parking spaces for every room sort of thing. And the city next to a park they just recently developed and got a big grant from the state also has a piece of property adjacent to it that they've been talking about doing hotel development next to.
Mm-hmm.
And my immediate thought was that seems very rigid, that feels very structured, because often what we talk about is that mixed use. And so I mentioned the idea of doing like mixed use, like storefronts on the bottom floor. And they said that, oh, we are interested in making sure that it like blends well with the new existing park, but we're more so looking at just doing a hotel. And I'm like, you could do a hotel with like short-term rentals and do other things with that. I mean, I've seen that. I've been in places that have that sort of like restaurants or small storefronts or little cafes on the bottom floor, and then the rooms are all on the top floor, because all you really need on the first floor is a lobby anyway. Um, and the whole thing just kind of sounded a little bit growth Ponzi scheme to me. It's like, oh, we're gonna get these rooms, and then again, the same thing. Similarly, we have four other hotels that are very much showing their age. Were probably built in the 70s or 80s, and desperately need some like modernization. And I think some of them would even fall into the category of like getting into that uh, historic reservation preservation area. And so it just feels like sort of misguided to me from the outside, but it does seem like that whole sort of like incentivized towards doing that quick and easy thing for a bunch of rooms really quickly, rather than doing something that might be a little bit more difficult and might require more moving parts, working with more people to like fill those rental spaces or whatever. But that's kind of it.
Yeah.
And I'm also not sure if other places have transient occupancy tax or how that works. So just if that's, I know it's not an explicit question. I was just looking
Yeah.
for any information on that, or if other people have had experiences with that.
Your background image actually reminds me of a great article that Addison Del Mastro wrote for the Strongtown site on the scale of the hotels that were constructed over the years, and basically how that scale has gotten out of whack. And he was actually applying it to the same problem of Whole Foods, for example. Their grocery store sort of template only suits a certain auto-based scale that is dependent on a significant portion of people living in an occupancy area in order to be able to keep it afloat. And your Hiltons and your DoubleTrees and all of these types of spaces have the same problem, that their number of expected sort of travelers into a space actually puts them out of the market of that they are actually trying to serve. And so either those other sites are so vulnerable. You said that aging hotels are vulnerable as they sort of fall off of the Expedia, like, looking great in a postcard sort of images, unless they get a significant amount of new investment. And this is where like things like a hotel tax could actually be used to really reinvest in the streetscape around these older hotels that are better situated within the fabric of the community, creating, like in McMinnville, Oregon, they have an amazing street front. And that street front is then this wealth generator for every type of existing use that's in the area. And they have these amazing, now boutique is just a name that you slap on something to get a little bit more out of your pricing. But they've got these amazing sort of amenities that are popping up. And their challenge is trying to figure out how do we cultivate more of this type of wealth building activity. And yeah, 3rd Street in McMinnville, John and I got to spend some time there with the local, or with folks that were interested in starting a local conversation there. And it is truly a gem as we go through it. But anybody that wants to jump on Danny's topic here related to hotels and sort of the way in which we sort of at times will bend over backwards to make sure that we are tournament ready. I know that that's a problem in a lot of communities, is they want to be tournament ready, which means they need to be ready for Black Friday. And I think we kind of have done with Black Friday parking a similar version of asking, does your community have too much of a good thing in parking that even on the busiest day of the year, you have excess capacity? And we actually see this situation that a lot of places really grapple. They're like, well, we need to be ready for the peak. Even though there are so many things that you can do to sort of offset that peak, allowing short-term rentals during specific seasons to make that process a little bit easier. How many times do people, take action to leave a community just while the big game is on? This is something in Norman, Oklahoma, where people would know when the college football schedule was out. They would basically book their vacations elsewhere, and somebody else would pay them to go on holidays by renting their home from them. This is actually not a problem. This can be a really good thing in a local community. It allows a home to actually generate income. and always saying, well, we need to roll out the welcome mat in order to make sure that we have enough hotel rooms for the busiest day of the year, creates then this glut, especially when you've subsidized those new entrants to your community to do that. Maybe another question then. I'm just double checking if we've got anything. Oh, John, thank you for the link to the Yard and Company Neighborhood Playbook. That's awesome as well. All right, here's a chance. Any questions?
Well, Danny, to follow up on your
Oh yeah.
transient stuff, I was looking really quickly on the web. So California has their version of hotel motel tax, which is transient occupancy tax. Lots of cities have that. That funding doesn't look like it is overly restricted what a city could do with it. So lots of cities, they increase their hotel motel tax quite high and they reinvest those funds. So when I was in Ransom, West Virginia, we could take our hotel motel tax and we could split it between our CVB, our Convention and Visitors Bureau, and our Parks and Rec department. So our Parks Direct department was fully funded off of all the hotel motel tax. So, and that tax is being funded by people visiting from out of town. So it's not our residents paying for it. So the things that you're asking for, that's a good way to leverage it, to think about the types of improvements you would want, like to improve the waterfront parks, maybe to go put boat parking somewhere else, all those things to fund to increase the value in town. So thinking smart about that is one way to do those things. And that's usually a pretty easy tax to collect. So in West Virginia, for all of the Airbnb and Turbo and all those things, we just had state legislation that the state would collect all of that for us because those apps all do it, and then we would just get a check every month on it. So thinking of the business model locally, that might be a benefit. And then on the hotel side, yeah, you should think about, and we should all be thinking about our cities as master developers. We have a lot that we can ask of our development community when it comes. So if even the strip shopping malls, they all have these books of all the requirements that they impose. Like if the grocery store comes in, no other grocery store can be so many lanes out, or the whatever dollar store comes in, they get a sign out on the street. All of these things are set. That developer that owns that shopping center will only allow the things that will generate more revenue on their investment. If we thought about that from a city side, the city would make way more money if the ground floor of that hotel had outward facing things. I did some resort planning with some resort hotels. The conventional way that you do a resort hotel is you have the gift shop, the bar, the restaurant, um, all of this stuff inside. You have to go through the front door of the hotel and then use the inside stuff and then go up in the tower. What a lot of hotels were realizing is in resort areas, there are people that aren't staying at the hotel and there's off seasons with locals. That if that was outward facing, they could generate more revenue off of it. So by taking the gift shop and having a door out to the street, also now it was the hotel gift shop, but an actual retail bay to the street. The restaurant now had outdoor dining on the street. The bar had visibility to the street, so it contributed to that outside area. It frees up the floor plan behind it so that now you don't have blank walls on the street and all the service stuff is behind those active uses. And the hotel bedrooms and ballrooms can float above that. So if we think about developer as a developer, what is the long-term investment? Understanding this building's going to last, optimistically 50 years, it has a lot of impact. You can leverage some of those things. And if it's a business model, if it's like, oh, we can't make that work because that's not our business model, or that's going to cost us more money. You have the hotel motel tax to look at and say, look, we could reinvest that for you for a certain time to fill the gap because it's probably not that far off. Or around town, we have a dozen people that are looking for retail space that want micro retail by lots of people coming from out of town. We can introduce you to them so you could be pre-leased before you start construction. And that's what a developer would do. That is something a city could do. And it's not that the city is designing it, the city is encouraging the type of development they want.
Thank you.
Awesome.
That's very helpful. I also wanted to tidbit about my background. This building that you see here is actually no longer a hotel. It collapsed during an earthquake, and so pretty much the whole 2 floors are gone. And one of the reasons I love this building is hearing about the corner lot development and the way that this fronts. There's actually a park, what would be across the street here on this side, and then the main street runs sort of in front of it where my head is. And this building just like I found this image after hearing about the corner lot design and how you can do good corner lot design. And now it is just pretty much a cafe. And this whole wall that you see where it wrapped around with the ivy is just a giant blank brick wall now. And so I changed it as I thought it would be fitting. And I love the corner lots so much now.
Yeah. I I saw a thing about Baltimore's neighborhood or whatchamacallit. It was Baltimore's corner bars, all of the like little pubs that they have that are right like sort of situated right behind you there. And I was like, man, our place needs a lot more of those. So John, you had a question from a local conversation leader. So why don't you take it away?
Yeah, thank you. I said I would bring this to one of these Ask Strong Towns Anything sessions. This is from a local conversation in Burlington, Vermont. The group is called Vermonters for People-Oriented Places. And he starts with a little bit of context. He says that Burlington is dealing with more and more roadblocks when it comes to their walking and biking infrastructure plans, as well as their housing expansion plans. He said that the city actually has a pretty robust like walk bike plan that was supposed to be completed in 2026, but the city council recently acknowledged that they are actually nowhere near their goals, and in some cases they're actually even moving backwards. And so now they want to push the plan back to 2040. Burlington also has one of the narrowest like vacancy rates in the entire country, and in an unhoused population that is increasing in size. And the leader says that the city council portrays themselves as addressing this, but they are opposing steps in the right direction. There was also, sadly, a recent cyclist fatality by an on-duty police cruiser in a neighboring town that has really shaken up kind of the whole region. And the crash happened on a road called Shelbourne Road, which at this point has named itself the most dangerous street in the state for bicyclists and people on foot. And so the question really is this. They said, we're hoping that an expert with a Strong Towns perspective can take a glance into our current infrastructure and situation and highlight potential solutions. This could improve the footing for organizations like ours and concerned community members to get things moving in the right direction again and prevent any more serious injuries and fatalities. So really, because we can't do that for every community, like what is the first step for a local conversation like this, or a Strong Towns local advocate like this, or a group of people, really, because that is an important aspect of it, to start moving in, getting their city moving in a positive direction?
It's a really, I mean, packed question. And I think there's so many different first steps to take. Part of it is gathering a group of people that are passionate about this, talking about these things. I hear in the question this yearning, can an expert come and help us like address what's going on? And I think what they are recognizing is that they are at the local level actually well equipped to be able to analyze like where are people struggling? What is it that is like the most common challenges that people are facing? And sometimes it does take that opportunity to then raise the question together with a group of people. You know, Edward Erfurt does a lot of coaching with community leaders. He will provide that coaching, but we in order to justify the amount of time that is taking, we provide a cost service for that. But for local groups, one of our core things is saying, here's how you can take on a particular project to highlight this is an unsafe intersection. How do you do that? Or this is unsafe street design. Conduct a crash analysis studio. Take an opportunity to go through the training course that we've put together on how to conduct a crash analysis studio. That is how to review a crash that has occurred that has either caused a fatality or caused a significant injury to someone in your community, to name them and know them and grieve with them as you go through the process of saying, what is it that we can do to make this intersection, instead of being a place marked by apathy or by poor design, take note of the actual specific things in the context and improve it over time. Identify what are the short-term actions that we can take to often narrow the roadway, often reduce speed, as Josh Stewart in the Bottom Up Short episode talked about. In Littleton, Colorado, he said he was asking the city, why is it that we have this awful intersection? And they said, well, it was designed in order to make it really complex and complicated. And the idea behind it is then people are going to naturally want to slow down, which sounds right. But he said, what was interesting, he said, but locals, or you could substitute police officers that know the area, within a short amount of time, they figure out how to rapidly proceed through it. Well, I always say, if Formula One cars can be slowed down with chicanes, and they are the most nimble, agile things in the world, but if you have a straightaway and you want them to slow down before they go into a hard banking corner, you just put in a chicane. They really have to figure out ways to navigate that space. We know how to do that with interventions like curb bump outs, other types of tools like that, that really make a difference. But I think there's another layer of it, which is increasing awareness of where the dangers lie, as well as what the long-term sort of cost obligations to the community are. Doing simple things like, hey, we can compare the value per acre of sites that are adjacent to our streets that we have made, have just made the confirmation, or sorry, made the calculation that they should primarily be used for vehicles, for moving cars through. How does that economic performance compare with the performance of spaces that are allowed to rest a bit, allowed to not be noisy and clamorous and unsafe? And in that context, you often find, oh, there's a lot more value here than we realized in the spaces that we've often sort of neglected or overlooked because they're not on the main thoroughfares. Is there something about those types of thoroughfare designs that actually create a depressed economic circumstances in our community, even if the big, because it's a large lot, they must be paying lots of property tax, but in comparison on a per lot basis, on a per acre basis, they're not taking up nearly as much. And then the other thing is just beginning to advocate for a positive vision of what they want to see in their community. I think that's a key part of it. What are you for in Burlington? I do love Burlington, or Burlington for people-oriented places, because that's Burpop. And then we also just had Kearney for people-oriented places, which is K-pop, which is awesome. And I lead a group called Del Pop, which is not quite as fun, but once we carve off North Delta and South Delta, it'll be Sodel Pop, which will be, if you say it quick, sounds like soda pop. So all that to say, but before I get too distracted, I want to throw the question to others as well. Is there anything that you would give guidance to these leaders that are really trying to grapple with how do we contend with some of these core pressures in our community and where to start? Maybe you do, John. What was your first round of response, and then to some of the others here?
Well, can I, this is not me trying to get out of it, but this is a question that I'd brought up with Edward before. And Edward talked about the power of the four-step process when it comes to something like this. And so I'd actually like to cede my time to Edward to see what he might say about how the four-step process really relates to this.
So, yeah, no, thanks, John, because Burlington's asking about 5 or 6 different things. So they've hit all of our core campaigns. So let's just start with the most fundamental thing. As professionals, and I've been in that consulting world and professional world for so long, it's really easy for me to jump to a problem solution mindset. So we have a problem, let's go find the solution. We're going to find the perfect consultant, the perfect plan, all those things, and hope that works out. What I actually found working through that four-step process is really identifying, instead of talking problem solution, let's talk struggle response. So whether it's the housing or the street, I don't know. Let me start with the street. On a street, it's a dangerous road. All right, that's a major problem. But what is what is a struggle? Like if we had one sentence, if we had one thing to point on, is that an intersection? Is that lack of street trees? Is that a speed issue? Like just pick one. So let's start with that. Let's get that to a single sentence. That is the struggle. How do we respond to that? And when we sit around and talk about it, and if we start to get off into the realm of somebody else, or we'll wait for the state, then we need to go back to let's table that and let's go find a different struggle. We will eventually find a struggle that we can tackle to deal with that. The the most powerful thing that citizens can do, because that's I'm thinking that's this audience, is to show up at City Hall and talk about this issue. And you talk about an issue in two different approaches. One, you talk about all of the great streets in your town. Spend a lot of time sharing all the great places in the community, the streets you like, the ones that are two lane, that are slow traffic, the ones that kids play in the street on, that they close off to do hockey in, like that type of stuff. Point those out. The one by the park is easy for you to park and do all the things you want to do. Really point those out. Anytime the city does something to those to enhance it, or a group, Boy Scouts do a planning project, show up at City Hall, make sure everybody knows that's incredible, like reinforce that. Then you go through and you start to identify a struggle. Well, this street is not like that. Why can't this street be like that? And that starts a conversation. It's not confrontational. It starts that piece forward. And you could tackle that with all of these. The easiest thing for citizens to do is talk about the things they love because they know. And that's where I would start. The technical folks will come to you. They will show up. Uh, they're either already in City Hall, they're a member of Strong Towns, or they're on the email list of Strong Towns, so they know the words you're using, but maybe they're not active in your local conversation. Maybe they're not in your realm, and you can build trust with them, and they will help guide you in moving forward. There may be elected officials, the same thing. So that's where I would start, because I think it's if we can get to a struggle response, we migrate ourselves into the four-step process. And through the four-step process, we can do lots and lots of things. We can succeed at some, fail at a few, and work our way up to it. Once we start describing the places we love, once we start describing what we like, it's really hard to unsee that. And it, like right now, it's probably hard for the city to see that that road that's so dangerous is a road and it's ugly. It's moving lots of cars, and other people have attributes they've assigned to it that they like for it. But when they realize it is so different than the rest of the community, and it is sucking out economics, it's taking lives, all of those things. Um, Now we can start tackling, well, what do we do? What could we do quickly? And that four-step process really kicks in on it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Edward.
We're coming up on the end of our time. I hope this format, I promised to get through about 8 questions today was my goal, and we got through 3 or 4. But I don't mind. We're working our way up here, learning some tactics as we go. But I did want to highlight the fact that we have a local motive session coming up here. And those sessions, oh, actually here, let me just make this a little bit easier to see. These sessions are starting in March, and which is now. March 20th is the first one, building a thriving local conversation and advocating for main streets in Baton Rouge. There's then a follow-up session on the 27th, or not follow-up, but featuring Donna Boolin's Bloomington, Illinois, but particularly featuring Noah Tang on incremental development and local conversation leadership. The next one is how to give great public comment and build safe streets in Santa Barbara. That's the work that Sully is doing with his group there, Sully Israel, as well as others in his community. Finding a highway in New Orleans. I got to connect with Amy Stelly, who is the host for this session, and she is amazing, just doing some really dynamic things. The list of things that we're going to be talking about is going to be really awesome for that one. Again, April 17th, creating a small-scale development movement in Buffalo. I also got to brief Bernice Rattle on how our session is going to go, and I was really excited for it. I'm really excited to introduce more of our members to what the work that Bernice is doing, but also particularly ask that question: how do we create a small-scale development movement in our communities? And then finally, regional organizing and letter writing campaigns in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with Andrew and Anna Carley. They were featured on the Bottom Up Shorts podcast. If you want to listen a little bit to what they had to say, and there's so much more to dive into with them. And so with that, I would definitely encourage you to sign up for the Locomotive Tour. As a member, you get a discount. I believe it's Time for Action, all caps, using the letter or the number 4. So TIME and then the number 4 action, all caps, gets you your member discount as you do the sign up. I would tell you to do this no matter what, but it is one of the tools that we're able to distribute these types of resources very broadly, partly because of member support making this possible. And so we definitely encourage you to sign up for the Strong Towns Locomotive Tour. Maybe if anybody wants to, you can volunteer that you've already signed up, which would be fantastic as well. But out of that, we're coming up on the end of our time. I do also want to highlight, we will be posting this on the website very soon here. On March 20th, we are going to be hosting Joe Minicozy with Urban 3 for a webinar related to where our city's wealth is going and the question of how do we cultivate more wealth for our communities. And so it certainly ties into the questions of what do we do with vacant land? What do we do with types of investment practices around hotels or other things like this? Where does the money in our community flow, and what can we do to help that money to slow down, to saturate within our communities, to use the language of is it Don Gibbons with economic gardening, to really allow the bathtub of wealth within a community to be added to without much of it being siphoned away. And so in that context, I hope that you've enjoyed this session of Ask Strong Towns Anything. Thank you so much for being a Strong Towns member, continuing to support this movement, and being a key part of distributing these ideas in your community, helping others to take hold of the challenges that they face and to ask that question: what is the next smallest thing that we can do, prompted by our local insights here, to actually address the challenges that we face, and then to go out and do that thing, often collaboratively together with other people in your community. And so with that, thank you so much for participating in Ask Strong Towns Anything.